By this time, the waters had visibly diminished. The torrent had once more become a river, though a very rapid one, it is true. However, by pursuing a zigzag course and overcoming it to a certain extent, John hoped to reach the opposite shore. At 12:30, they embarked provisions enough for a couple of days. The remainder was left with the wagon and the tent. Mulready was doing well enough to be carried over. His convalescence was rapid. At 1 o'clock, they all seated themselves on the raft, still moored to the shore. John Mangles had installed himself at the starboard and entrusted to Wilson a sort of oar to steady the raft against the current and lessen the leeway. He took his own stand at the back to steer by means of a large scull, but notwithstanding their efforts, Wilson and John Mangles soon found themselves in an inverse position, which made the action of the oars impossible. There was no help for it. They could do nothing to arrest the gyratory movement of the raft. It turned round with dizzying rapidity and drifted out of its course. John Mangles stood with pale face and set teeth, gazing at the whirling current. However, the raft had reached the middle of the river, about half a mile from the starting point. Here the current was extremely strong, and this broke the whirling eddy and gave the raft some stability. John and Wilson seized their oars again and managed to push it in an oblique direction. This brought them nearer to the left shore. They were not more than 50 fathoms from it when Wilson's oar snapped short off, and the raft, no longer supported, was dragged away. John tried to resist at the risk of breaking his own oar, too, and Wilson, with bleeding hands, seconded his efforts with all his might. At last they succeeded, and the raft, after a passage of more than half an hour, struck against the steep bank of the opposite shore. The shock was so violent that the logs became disunited, the cords broke, and the water bubbled up between. The travelers had barely time to catch hold of the steep bank. They dragged out Mulready and the two dripping ladies. Everyone was safe, but the provisions and firearms, except the carbine of the major, went drifting down with the debris of the raft. The river was crossed. The little company found themselves almost without provisions, 35 miles from Delegate, in the midst of the unknown deserts of the Victoria frontier. Neither settlers nor squatters were to be met with. It was entirely uninhabited, unless by ferocious bushrangers and bandits. They resolved to set off without delay. Mulready saw clearly that he would be a great drag on them, and he begged to be allowed to remain, and even to remain alone, till assistance could be sent from Delegate. Glenarvan refused. It would be 3 days before he could reach Delegate and 5 the shore, that is to say, the 26th of January. Now, as the Duncan had left Melbourne on the 16th, what difference would a few days' delay make? "No, my friend," he said, "I will not leave anyone behind. We will make a litter and carry you in turn." The litter was made of boughs of eucalyptus covered with branches, and, whether he would or not, Mulready was obliged to take his place on it. Glenarvan would be the first to carry his sailor. He took hold of one end and Wilson of the other, and all set off. What a sad spectacle, and how lamentably was this expedition to end which had commenced so well. They were no longer in search of Harry Grant. This continent, where he was not and never had been, threatened to prove fatal to those who sought him, and when these intrepid countrymen of his should reach the shore, they would find the Duncan waiting to take them home again. The first day passed silently and painfully. Every 10 minutes the litter changed bearers. All the sailors' comrades took their share in this task without murmuring, though the fatigue was augmented by the great heat. In the evening, after a journey of only 5 miles, they camped under the gum trees. The small store of provisions saved from the raft composed the evening meal, but all they had to depend upon now was the major's carbine. It was a dark, rainy night, and morning seemed as if it would never dawn. They set off again, but the major could not find a chance of firing a shot. This fatal region was only a desert, unfrequented even by animals. Fortunately, Robert discovered a bustard's nest with a dozen of large eggs in it, which Albinette cooked on hot cinders. These, with a few roots of purslane which were growing at the bottom of a ravine, were all the breakfast of the 22D. The route now became extremely difficult. The sandy plains were bristling with spinifex, a prickly plant which is called in Melbourne the porcupine. It tears the clothing to rags and makes the legs bleed. The courageous ladies never complained, but footed it bravely, setting an example and encouraging one and another by word or look. They stopped in the evening at Mount Bulla Bulla, on the edge of the Yungala Creek. The supper would have been very scant if McNabbs had not killed a large rat, the Mews conditor, which is highly spoken of as an article of diet. Albinette roasted it, and it would have been pronounced even superior to its reputation had it equaled the sheep in size. They were obliged to be content with it, however, and it was devoured to the bones. On the 23D, the weary but still energetic travelers started off again. After having gone round the foot of the mountain, they crossed the long prairies where the grass seemed made of whalebone. It was a tangle of darts, a medley of sharp little sticks, and a path had to be cut through either with the hatchet or fire. That morning there was not even a question of breakfast. Nothing could be more barren than this region strewn with pieces of quartz. Not only hunger, but thirst began to assail the travelers. A burning atmosphere heightened their discomfort. Glenarvan and his friends could only go half a mile an hour. Should this lack of food and water continue till evening, they would all sink on the road, never to rise again. But when everything fails a man, and he finds himself without resources, at the very moment when he feels he must give up, then Providence steps in. Water presented itself in the cephalotes, a species of cup-shaped flower, filled with refreshing liquid, which hung from the branches of coralliform-shaped bushes. They all quenched their thirst with these and felt new life returning. The only food they could find was the same as the natives were forced to subsist upon, when they could find neither game, nor serpents, nor insects. Paganel discovered in the dry bed of a creek a plant whose excellent properties had been frequently described by one of his colleagues in the Geographical Society. It was the nardu, a cryptogamous plant of the family Marcellacea, and the same which kept Burke and King alive in the deserts of the interior. Under its leaves, which resembled those of the trefoil, there were dried sporals as large as a lentil, and these sporals, when crushed between two stones, made a sort of flour. This was converted into coarse bread, which stilled the pangs of hunger at least. There was a great abundance of this plant growing in the district, and Albinett gathered a large supply, so that they were sure of food for several days. The next day, the 24th, Mulready was able to walk part of the way. His wound was entirely cicatrized. The town of Delegate was not more than 10 miles off, and that evening they camped in longitude 140 degrees on the very frontier of New South Wales. For some hours, a fine but penetrating rain had been falling. There would have been no shelter from this, if by chance John Mangles had not discovered a sawyer's hut, deserted and dilapidated to a degree. But with this miserable cabin, they were obliged to be content. Wilson wanted to kindle a fire to prepare the nardu bread, and he went out to pick up the dead wood scattered all over the ground. But he found it would not light. The great quantity of albuminous matter, which it contained, prevented all combustion. This is the incombustible wood put down by Paganel in his list of Australian products. They had to dispense with fire, and consequently with food too, and sleep in their wet clothes, while the laughing jackasses, concealed in the high branches, seemed to ridicule the poor unfortunates. However, Glenarvan was nearly at the end of his sufferings. It was time. The two young ladies were making heroic efforts, but their strength was hourly decreasing. They dragged themselves along, almost unable to walk. Next morning they started at daybreak. At 11 a.m. Delegate came in sight in the county of Wellesley, and 50 miles from Twofold Bay. Means of conveyance were quickly procured here. Hope returned to Glenarvan as they approached the coast. Perhaps there might have been some slight delay, and after all, they might get there before the arrival of the Duncan. In 24 hours they would reach the bay. At noon, after a comfortable meal, all the travelers installed in a mail coach, drawn by 5 strong horses, left Delegate at a gallop. The postilions, stimulated by a promise of a princely douceur, drove rapidly along over a well-kept road. They did not lose a minute in changing horses, which took place every 10 miles. It seemed as if they were infected with Glenarvan's zeal. All that day and night, too, they traveled on at the rate of 6 miles an hour. In the morning at sunrise, a dull murmur fell on their ears and announced their approach to the Indian Ocean. They required to go round the bay to gain the coast at the 37th parallel, the exact point where Tom Austin was to wait their arrival. When the sea appeared, all eyes anxiously gazed at the offing. Was the Duncan, by a miracle of Providence, there running close to the shore, as a month ago, when they crossed Cape Corrients, they had found her on the Argentine coast? They saw nothing. Sky and earth mingled in the same horizon. Not a sail enlivened the vast stretch of ocean. One hope still remained. Perhaps Tom Austin had thought it his duty to cast anchor in Twofold Bay, for the sea was heavy, and a ship would not dare to venture near the shore. "To Eden!" cried Glenarvan. Immediately the mail coach resumed the route round the bay, toward the little town of Eden, 5 miles distant. The postilions stopped not far from the lighthouse, which marks the entrance of the port. Several vessels were moored in the roadstead, but none of them bore the flag of Malcolm. Glenarvan, John Mangles, and Paganel got out of the coach, and rushed to the custom house, to inquire about the arrival of vessels within the last few days. No ship had touched the bay for a week. Perhaps the yacht has not started, Glenarvan said, a sudden revulsion of feeling lifting him from despair. Perhaps we have arrived first. John Mangles shook his head. He knew Tom Austin. His first mate would not delay the execution of an order for 10 days. I must know at all events how they stand, said Glenarvan. Better certainty than doubt. A quarter of an hour afterward, a telegram was sent to the syndicate of shipbrokers in Melbourne. The whole party then repaired to the Victoria Hotel. At 2 p.m. the following telegraphic reply was received. Lord Glenarvan, Eden. Twofold Bay. The Duncan left on the 16th current. Destination unknown. J. Andrews, S.B. The telegram dropped from Glenarvan's hands. There was no doubt now. The good, honest Scotch yacht was now a pirate ship in the hands of Ben Joyce. So ended this journey across Australia, which had commenced under circumstances so favorable. All trace of Captain Grant and his shipwrecked men seemed to be irrevocably lost. This ill success had cost the loss of a ship's crew. Lord Glenarvan had been vanquished in the strife, and the courageous searchers, whom the unfriendly elements of the Pampas had been unable to check, had been conquered on the Australian shore by the perversity of man. End of Book 2. In Search of the Castaways, or The Children of Captain Grant. New Zealand. Chapter 1, A Rough Captain. If ever the searchers after Captain Grant were tempted to despair, surely it was at this moment, when all their hopes were destroyed at a blow. Toward what quarter of the world should they direct their endeavors? How were they to explore new countries? The Duncan was no longer available, and even an immediate return to their own land was out of the question. Thus the enterprise of these generous Scots had failed. Failed, a despairing word that finds no echo in a brave soul, and yet under the repeated blows of adverse fate, Glenarvan himself was compelled to acknowledge his inability to prosecute his devoted efforts. Mary Grant at this crisis nerved herself to the resolution never to utter the name of her father. She suppressed her own anguish when she thought of the unfortunate crew who had perished. The daughter was merged in the friend, and she now took upon her to console Lady Glenarvan, who till now had been her faithful comforter. She was the first to speak of returning to Scotland. John Mangles was filled with admiration at seeing her so courageous and so resigned. He wanted to say a word further in the captain's interest, but Mary stopped him with a glance and afterward said to him, "No, Mr. John, we must think of those who ventured their lives. Lord Glenarvan must return to Europe." "You are right, Miss Mary," answered John Mangles. "He must. Beside, the English authorities must be informed of the fate of the Duncan. But do not despair. Rather than abandon our search, I will resume it alone. I will either find Captain Grant or perish in the attempt." It was a serious undertaking to which John Mangles bound himself. Mary accepted and gave her hand to the young captain, as if to ratify the treaty. On John Mangles' side it was a life's devotion, on Mary's undying gratitude. During that day, their departure was finally arranged. They resolved to reach Melbourne without delay. Next day John went to inquire about the ships ready to sail. He expected to find frequent communication between Eden and Victoria. He was disappointed. Ships were scarce. 3 or 4 vessels, anchored in Twofold Bay, constituted the mercantile fleet of the place. None of them were bound for Melbourne, nor Sydney, nor Point de Galle, at any of which ports Glenarvan would have found ships loading for England. In fact, the Peninsular and Oriental Company has a regular line of packets between these points and England. Under these circumstances, what was to be done? Waiting for a ship might be a tedious affair, for Twofold Bay is not much frequented. Numbers of ships pass by without touching. After due reflection and discussion, Glenarvan had nearly decided to follow the coast road to Sydney, when Paganel made an unexpected proposition. The geographer had visited Twofold Bay on his own account, and was aware that there were no means of transport for Sydney or Melbourne. But of the 3 vessels anchored in the roadstead, one was loading for Auckland, the capital of the northern island of New Zealand. Paganel's proposal was to take the ship in question and get to Auckland, whence it would be easy to return to Europe by the boats of the Peninsular and Oriental Company. This proposition was taken into serious consideration. Paganel on this occasion dispensed with the volley of arguments he generally indulged in. He confined himself to the bare proposition, adding that the voyage to New Zealand was only 5 or 6 days, the distance, in fact, being only about 1,000 miles. By a singular coincidence, Auckland is situated on the selfsame parallel, the 37th, which the explorers had perseveringly followed since they left the coast of Araucania. Paganel might fairly have used this as an argument in favor of his scheme. In fact, it was a natural opportunity of visiting the shores of New Zealand. But Paganel did not lay stress on this argument. After two mistakes, he probably hesitated to attempt a third interpretation of the document. Besides, what could he make of it? It said positively that a continent had served as a refuge for Captain Grant, not an island. Now, New Zealand was nothing but an island. This seemed decisive. Whether, for this reason, or for some other, Paganel did not connect any idea of further search with this proposition of reaching Auckland. He merely observed that regular communication existed between that point and Great Britain, and that it was easy to take advantage of it. John Mangles supported Paganel's proposal. He advised its adoption, as it was hopeless to await the problematical arrival of a vessel in Twofold Bay. But before coming to any decision, he thought it best to visit the ship mentioned by the geographer. Glenarvan, the Major, Paganel, Robert, and Mangles himself took a boat, and a few strokes brought them alongside the ship anchored 2 cables' length from the quay. It was a brig of 150 tons, named the Macquarie. It was engaged in the coasting trade between the various ports of Australia and New Zealand. The captain, or rather the master, received his visitors gruffly enough. They perceived that they had to do with a man of no education, and whose manners were in no degree superior to those of the 5 sailors of his crew. With a coarse, red face, thick hands, and a broken nose, blind of an eye, and his lips stained with the pipe, Will Halley was a sadly brutal-looking person. But they had no choice, and for so short a voyage it was not necessary to be very particular. "What do you want?" asked Will Halley, when the strangers stepped on the poop of his ship. "The captain," answered John Mangles. "I am the captain," said Halley. "What else do you want?" "The Macquarie is loading for Auckland, I believe." "Yes, what else?" "What does she carry?" "Everything saleable and purchasable. What else?" "When does she sail?" "Tomorrow at the midday tide. What else?" "Does she take passengers?" "That depends on who the passengers are, and whether they are satisfied with the ship's mess." "They would bring their own provisions." "What else?" "What else?" "Yes, how many are there?" 9, 2 of them are ladies." "I have no cabins." "We will manage with such space as may be left at their disposal." "What else?" "Do you agree?" said John Mangles, who was not in the least put out by the captain's peculiarities. "We'll see," said the master of the Macquarie. Will Halley took 2 or 3 turns on the poop, making it resound with iron-heeled boots, and then he turned abruptly to John Mangles. "What would you pay?" said he. "What do you ask?" replied John. £50. Glenarvan looked consent. "Very good, £50, replied John Mangles. "But passage only," added Halley. "Yes, passage only." "Food extra." "An extra." "Agreed, and now," said Will, putting out his hand, "what about the deposit money?" "Here is half of the passage money, £25, said Mangles, counting out the sum to the master. "All aboard tomorrow," said he, "before noon, whether or no I weigh anchor." "We will be punctual." This said, Glenarvan, the Major, Robert, Paganel, and John Mangles left the ship, Halley not so much as touching the oilskin that adorned his red locks. "What a brute!" exclaimed John. "He will do," answered Paganel. "He is a regular sea-wolf." "A downright bear," added the Major. "I fancy," said John Mangles, "that the said bear has dealt in human flesh in his time." "What matter?" answered Glenarvan, "as long as he commands the Macquarie, and the Macquarie goes to New Zealand. From Twofold Bay to Auckland we shall not see much of him. After Auckland we shall see him no more." Lady Helena and Mary Grant were delighted to hear that their departure was arranged for tomorrow. Glenarvan warned them that the Macquarie was inferior in comfort to the Duncan, but after what they had gone through, they were indifferent to trifling annoyances. Wilson was told off to arrange the accommodation on board the Macquarie. under his busy brush and broom things soon changed their aspect. Well, Halley shrugged his shoulders and let the sailor have his way. Glenarvan and his party gave him no concern. He neither knew nor cared to know their names. His new freight represented 50 pounds, and he rated it far below the 200 tons of cured hides which were stowed away in his hold. Skins first, men after. He was a merchant. As to his sailor qualification, he was said to be skillful enough in navigating these seas, whose reefs make them very dangerous. As the day drew to a close, Glenarvan had a desire to go again to the point on the coast cut by the 37th parallel. Two motives prompted him. He wanted to examine once more the presumed scene of the wreck. Ayrton had certainly been quartermaster on the Britannia, and the Britannia might have been lost on this part of the Australian coast, on the east coast if not on the west. It would not do to leave without thorough investigation, a locality which they were never to revisit. And then, failing the Britannia, the Duncan certainly had fallen into the hands of the convicts. Perhaps there had been a fight? There might yet be found on the coast traces of a struggle, a last resistance. If the crew had perished among the waves probably had thrown some bodies on the shore. Glenarvan, accompanied by his faithful John, went to carry out the final search. The landlord of the Victoria Hotel lent them 2 horses, and they set out on the northern road that skirts Twofold Bay. It was a melancholy journey. Glenarvan and Captain John trotted along without speaking, but they understood each other. The same thoughts, the same anguish harrowed both their hearts. They looked at the sea-worn rocks. They needed no words of question or answer. John's well-tried zeal and intelligence were a guarantee that every point was scrupulously examined, the least likely places, as well as the sloping beaches and sandy plains, where even the slight tides of the Pacific might have thrown some fragments of wreck. But no indication was seen that could suggest further search in that quarter. All trace of the wreck escaped them still. As to the Duncan, no trace either. All that part of Australia, bordering the ocean, was desert. Still John Mangles discovered on the skirts of the shore evident traces of camping, remains of fires recently kindled under solitary myall trees. Had a tribe of wandering blacks passed that way lately? No, for Glenarvan saw a token which furnished incontestable proof that the convicts had frequented that part of the coast. This token was a gray and yellow garment worn and patched, an ill-omened rag thrown down at the foot of a tree. It bore the convict's original number at the Perth Penitentiary. The felon was not there, but his filthy garments betrayed his passage. This livery of crime, after having clothed some miscreant, was now decaying on this desert shore. "You see, John," said Glenarvan, "the convicts got as far as here, and our poor comrades of the Duncan." "Yes," said John in a low voice, "they never landed, they perished." "Those wretches," cried Glenarvan. "If ever they fall into my hands, I will avenge my crew." Grief had hardened Glenarvan's features. For some minutes he gazed at the expanse before him, as if taking a last look at some ship disappearing in the distance. Then his eyes became dim. He recovered himself in a moment, and without a word or look, set off at a gallop toward Eden. The wanderers passed their last evening sadly enough. Their thoughts recalled all the misfortunes they had encountered in this country. They remembered how full of well-warranted hope they had been at Cape Bernouilli, and how cruelly disappointed at Twofold Bay. Paganel was full of feverish agitation. John Mangles, who had watched him since the affair at Snowy River, felt that the geographer was hesitating whether to speak or not to speak. 1,000 times he had pressed him with questions, and failed in obtaining an answer. But that evening, John, in lighting him to his room, asked him why he was so nervous. "Friend John," said Paganel evasively, "I am not more nervous tonight than I always am." "Mr. Paganel," answered John, "you have a secret that chokes you." "Well," cried the geographer, gesticulating, "what can I do? It is stronger than I." "What is stronger?" "My joy on the one hand, my despair on the other." "You rejoice and despair at the same time." "Yes, at the idea of visiting New Zealand." "Why, have you any trace?" asked John eagerly. "Have you recovered the lost tracks?" "No, friend John, no one returns from New Zealand, but still, you know human nature. All we want to nourish hope is breath. My device is Spiro Sparrow, and it is the best motto in the world." Chapter 2: Navigators and Their Discoveries. Next day, the 27th of January, the passengers of the Macquarie were installed on board the brig. Will Halley had not offered his cabin to his lady passengers. This omission was the less to be deplored, for the den was worthy of the bear. At 12:30, the anchor was weighed, having been loosed from its holding ground with some difficulty. A moderate breeze was blowing from the southwest. The sails were gradually unfurled. The five hands made slow work. Wilson offered to assist the crew, but Halley begged him to be quiet and not to interfere with what did not concern him. He was accustomed to manage his own affairs and required neither assistance nor advice. This was aimed at John Mangles, who had smiled at the clumsiness of some maneuver. John took the hint, but mentally resolved that he would nevertheless hold himself in readiness in case the incapacity of the crew should endanger the safety of the vessel. However, in time, the sails were adjusted by the five sailors, aided by the stimulus of the captain's oaths. The Macquarie stood out to sea on the larboard tack, under all her lower sails, topgallants, crossjack, and jib. By and by, the other sails were hoisted, but in spite of this additional canvas, the brig made very little way. Her rounded bow, the width of her hold, and her heavy stern made her a bad sailor, the perfect type of a wooden shoe. They had to make the best of it. Happily, 5 days, or at most 6, would take them to Auckland, no matter how bad a sailor the Macquarie was. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the Australian coast and the lighthouse of the Port of Eden had faded out of sight. The ship labored on the lumpy sea and rolled heavily in the trough of the waves. The passengers below suffered a good deal from this motion, but it was impossible to stay on deck, as it rained violently. Thus, they were condemned to close imprisonment. Each one of them was lost in his own reflections. Words were few. Now and then Lady Helena and Miss Grant exchanged a few syllables. Glenarvan was restless. He went in and out while the Major was impassive. John Mangles, followed by Robert, went on the poop from time to time to look at the weather. Paganel sat in his corner, muttering vague and incoherent words. What was the worthy geographer thinking of? Of New Zealand, the country to which destiny was leading him. He went mentally over all his history. He called to mind the scenes of the past in that illumined country. But in all that history, was there a fact? Was there a solitary incident that could justify the discoverers of these islands in considering them as a continent? Could a modern geographer or a sailor concede to them such a designation? Paganel was always revolving the meaning of the document. He was possessed with the idea. It became his ruling thought. After Patagonia, after Australia, his imagination, allured by a name, flew to New Zealand. But in that direction, one point, and only one, stood in his way. Contin, he repeated, that must mean continent. And then he resumed his mental retrospect of the navigators who made known to us these two great islands of the southern sea. It was on the 13th of December, 1642, that the Dutch navigator Tasman, after discovering Van Diemen's Land, sighted the unknown shores of New Zealand. He coasted along for several days, and on the 17th of December his ships penetrated into a large bay, which, terminating in a narrow strait, separated the two islands. The northern island was called by the natives Economani, a word which signifies the fish of Manny. The southern island was called Tavaipaunamu, the whale that yields the green stones. Abel Tasman sent his boats on shore, and they returned accompanied by 2 canoes and a noisy company of natives. These savages were middle height, of brown or yellow complexion, angular bones, harsh voices, and black hair, which was dressed in the Japanese manner and surmounted by a tall white feather. This first interview between Europeans and Aborigines seemed to promise amicable and lasting intercourse. But the next day, when one of Tasman's boats was looking for an anchorage nearer to the land, 7 canoes, manned by a great number of natives, attacked them fiercely. The boat capsized and filled. The quartermaster in command was instantly struck with a badly sharpened spear and fell into the sea. Of his 6 companions, 4 were killed. The other 2 and the quartermaster were able to swim to the ships and were picked up and recovered. After this sad occurrence, Tasman set sail, confining his revenge to giving the natives a few musket shots, which probably did not reach them. He left this bay, which still bears the name of Massacre Bay, followed the western coast, and on the 5th of January, anchored near the northernmost point. Here the violence of the surf, as well as the unfriendly attitude of the natives, prevented his obtaining water, and he finally quitted these shores, giving them the name State Land or the Land of the States, in honor of the States General. The Dutch navigator concluded that these islands were adjacent to the islands of the same name on the east of Terra del Fuego, at the southern point of the American continent. He thought he had found the great southern continent. But, said Paganel to himself, What a 17th century sailor might call a continent would never stand for one with a 19th century man. No such mistake can be supposed. No, there is something here that baffles me. Chapter 3: The Martyr of Navigators. On the 31st of January, 4 days after starting, the Macquarie had not done two-thirds of the distance between Australia and New Zealand. Will Halley took very little heed to the working of the ship. He let things take their chance. He seldom showed himself, for which no one was sorry. No one would have complained if he had passed all his time in his cabin, but for the fact that the brutal captain was every day under the influence of gin or brandy. His sailors willingly followed his example, and no ship ever sailed more entirely depending on Providence than the Macquarie did from Twofold Bay. This unpardonable carelessness obliged John Mangles to keep a watchful eye ever open. Mulready and Wilson more than once brought round the helm when some careless steering threatened to throw the ship on her beam ends. Often Will Halley would interfere and abuse the two sailors with a volley of oaths. The latter, in their impatience, would have liked nothing better than to bind this drunken captain and lower him into the hold for the rest of the voyage. But John Mangles succeeded, after some persuasion, in calming their well-grounded indignation. Still, the position of things filled him with anxiety, but, for fear of alarming Glenarvan, he spoke only to Paganel or the Major. McNabbs recommended the same course as Mulready and Wilson. "If you think it would be for the general good, John," said McNabbs, "you should not hesitate to take the command of the vessel. When we get to Auckland, the drunken imbecile can resume his command, and then he is at liberty to wreck himself, if that is his fancy." "All that is very true, Mr. McNabbs, and if it is absolutely necessary, I will do it. As long as we are on open sea, a careful lookout is enough. My sailors and I are watching on the poop, but when we get near the coast, I confess I shall be uneasy if Halley does not come to his senses." "Could not you direct the course?" asked Paganel. "That would be difficult," replied John. "Would you believe it that there is not a chart on board?" "Is that so?" "It is indeed. The Macquarie only does a coasting trade between Eden and Auckland, and Halley is so at home in these waters that he takes no observations. I suppose he thinks the ship knows the way and steers herself." "Ha, ha," laughed John Mangles. "I do not believe in ships that steer themselves, and if Halley is drunk when we get among soundings, he will get us all into trouble." "Let us hope," said Paganel, "that the neighborhood of land will bring him to his senses." "Well then," said McNabbs, "if needs were, you could not sail the Macquarie into Auckland." "Without a chart of the coast, certainly not. The coast is very dangerous. It is a series of shallow fjords as irregular and capricious as the fjords of Norway. There are many reefs, and it requires great experience to avoid them. The strongest ship would be lost if her keel struck one of those rocks that are submerged but a few feet below the water. In that case, those on board would have to take refuge on the coast." "If there was time—" "A terrible extremity," said Paganel, "for they are not hospitable shores, and the dangers of the land are not less appalling than the dangers of the sea." "You refer to the Maoris, Monsieur Paganel?" asked John Mangles. "Yes, my friend, they have a bad name in these waters. It is not a matter of timid or brutish Australians, but of an intelligent and sanguinary race, cannibals greedy of human flesh, man-eaters to whom we should look in vain for pity." "Well then," exclaimed the Major, "if Captain Grant had been wrecked on the coast of New Zealand, you would dissuade us from looking for him." "Oh, you might search on the coasts," replied the geographer, "because you might find traces of the Britannia, but not in the interior, for it would be perfectly useless. Every European who ventures into these fatal districts falls into the hands of the Maoris, and a prisoner in the hands of the Maoris is a lost man. I have urged my friends to cross the Pampas, to toil over the plains of Australia, but I will never lure them into the mazes of the New Zealand forest. May heaven be our guide, and keep us from ever being thrown within the power of those fierce natives." Chapter 4: The Wreck of the Macquarie. Still this wearisome voyage dragged on. On the 2d of February, 6 days from starting, the Macquarie had not yet made a nearer acquaintance with the shores of Auckland. The wind was fair, nevertheless, and blew steadily from the southwest, but the currents were against the ship's course, and she scarcely made any way. The heavy, lumpy sea strained her cordage, her timbers creaked, and she labored painfully in the trough of the sea. Her standing rigging was so out of order that it allowed play to the masts, which were violently shaken at every roll of the sea. Fortunately, Will was not a man in a hurry, and did not use a press of canvas, or his masts would inevitably have come down. John Mangles therefore hoped that the wretched hull would reach port without accident, but it grieved him that his companions should have to suffer so much discomfort from the defective arrangements of the brig. But neither Lady Helena nor Mary Grant uttered a word of complaint, though the continuous rain obliged them to stay below, where the want of air and the violence of the motion were painfully felt. They often braved the weather, and went on the poop till driven down again by the force of a sudden squall. Then they returned to the narrow space, fitter for stowing cargo than accommodating passengers, especially ladies. Their friends did their best to amuse them. Paganel tried to beguile the time with his stories, but it was a hopeless case. Their minds were so distracted at this change of route as to be quite unhinged. Much as they had been interested in his dissertation on the Pampas, or Australia, his lectures on New Zealand fell on cold and indifferent ears. Besides, they were going to this new and ill-reputed country without enthusiasm, without conviction, not even of their own free will, but solely at the bidding of destiny. Of all the passengers on board the Macquarie, the most to be pitied was Lord Glenarvan. He was rarely to be seen below. He could not stay in one place. His nervous organization, highly excited, could not submit to confinement between four narrow bulkheads. All day long, even all night, regardless of the torrents of rain and the dashing waves, he stayed on the poop, sometimes leaning on the rail, sometimes walking to and fro in feverish agitation. His eyes wandered ceaselessly over the blank horizon. He scanned it eagerly during every short interval of clear weather. It seemed as if he sought to question the voiceless waters. He longed to tear away the veil of fog and vapor that obscured his view. He could not be resigned, and his features expressed the bitterness of his grief. He was a man of energy, till now happy and powerful, and deprived in a moment of power and happiness. John Mangles bore him company, and endured with him the inclemency of the weather. On this day Glenarvan looked more anxiously than ever at each point where a break in the mist enabled him to do so. John came up to him and said, "Your lordship is looking out for land." Glenarvan shook his head in dissent. "And yet," said the young captain, "you must be longing to quit this vessel. We ought to have seen the lights of Auckland 36 hours ago." Glenarvan made no reply. He still looked, and for a moment his glass was pointed toward the horizon to windward. "The land is not on that side, my lord," said John Mangles. "Look more to starboard." "Why, John," replied Glenarvan, "I am not looking for the land." "What then's, my lord?" "My yacht, the Duncan," said Glenarvan hotly. "It must be here on these coasts, skimming these very waves, playing the vile part of a pirate. It is here, John, I am certain of it, on the track of vessels between Australia and New Zealand, and I have a presentiment that we shall fall in with her. God keep us from such a meeting." "Why, John?" "Your lordship forgets our position. What could we do in this ship if the Duncan gave chase? We could not even fly." "Fly, John?" "Yes, my lord, we should try in vain. We should be taken, delivered up to the mercy of those wretches, and Ben Joyce has shown us that he does not stop at a crime. Our lives would be worth little. We would fight to the death, of course, but after that. Think of Lady Glenarvan, think of Mary Grant." "Poor girls," murmured Glenarvan. "John, my heart is broken, and sometimes despair nearly masters me. I feel as if fresh misfortunes awaited us and that heaven itself is against us. It terrifies me." "You, my lord." "Not for myself, John, but for those I love, whom you love also." "Keep up your heart, my lord," said the young captain. "We must not look out for troubles. The Macquarie sails badly, but she makes some way nevertheless. Will is a brute, but I am keeping my eyes open, and if the coast looks dangerous, I will put the ship's head to sea again, so that on that score there is little or no danger. But as to getting alongside the Duncan, God forbid, and if your lordship is bent on looking out for her, let it be in order to give her a wide berth." John Mangles was right. An encounter with the Duncan would have been fatal to the Macquarie. There was every reason to fear such an engagement in these narrow seas, in which pirates could ply their trade without risk. However, for that day at least, the yacht did not appear, and the sixth night from their departure from Twofold Bay came, without the fears of John Mangles being realized. But that night was to be a night of terrors. Darkness came on almost suddenly at 7 o'clock in the evening. The sky was very threatening. The sailor instinct rose above the stupefaction of the drunkard and roused Will. He left his cabin, rubbed his eyes, and shook his great red head. Then he drew a great deep breath of air, as other people swallow a draught of water to revive themselves. He examined the masts. The wind freshened and, veering a point more to the westward, blew right for the New Zealand coast. Will Halley, with many an oath, called his men, tightened his topmast cordage, and made all snug for the night. John Mangles approved in silence. He had ceased to hold any conversation with the coarse seaman, but neither Glenarvan nor he left the poop. 2 hours after a stiff breeze came on, Will Halley took in the lower reef of his topsails. The maneuver would have been a difficult job for 5 men if the Macquarie had not carried a double yard, on the American plan. In fact, they had only to lower the upper yard to bring the sail to its smallest size. 2 hours passed, the sea was rising. The Macquarie was struck so violently that it seemed as if her keel had touched the rocks. There was no real danger, but the heavy vessel did not rise easily to the waves. By and by the returning waves would break over the deck in great masses. The boat was washed out of the davits by the force of the water. John Mangles never released his watch. Any other ship would have made no account of a sea like this. But with this heavy craft, there was a danger of sinking by the bow, for the deck was filled at every lurch, and the sheet of water, not being able to escape quickly by the scuppers, might submerge the ship. It would have been the wisest plan to prepare for emergency by knocking out the bulwarks with an axe to facilitate their escape, but Halley refused to take this precaution. But a greater danger was at hand, and one that it was too late to prevent. About 11:30, John Mangles and Wilson, who stayed on deck throughout the gale, were suddenly struck by an unusual noise. Their nautical instincts awoke. John seized the sailor's hand. "The reef," said he. "Yes," said Wilson, "the waves breaking on the bank. Not more than 2 cables' length off. At farthest, the land is there." John leaned over the side, gazed into the dark water, and called out, "Wilson, the lead." The master, posted forward, seemed to have no idea of his position. Wilson seized the lead line, sprang to the forechains, and threw the lead. The rope ran out between his fingers. At the third knot, the lead stopped. "3 fathoms," cried Wilson. "Captain," said John, running to Will Halley, "we are on the breakers." Whether or not he saw Halley shrug his shoulders is of very little importance, but he hurried to the helm, put it hard down, while Wilson, leaving the line, hauled at the main topsail brace to bring the ship to the wind. The man who was steering received a smart blow and could not comprehend the sudden attack. Let her go," said the young captain, working her to get away from the reefs. For half a minute the starboard side of the vessel was turned toward them, and in spite of the darkness, John could discern a line of foam which moaned and gleamed 4 fathoms away. At this moment, Will Halley, comprehending the danger, lost his head. His sailors, hardly sobered, could not understand his orders. His incoherent words, his contradictory orders showed that the stupid sot had quite lost his self-control. He was taken by surprise at the proximity of the land, which was 8 miles off, when he thought it was 30 or 40 miles off. The currents had thrown him out of his habitual track, and this miserable slave of routine was left quite helpless. Still, the prompt maneuver of John Mangles succeeded in keeping the Macquarie off the breakers, but John did not know the position. For anything he could tell, he was girdled in by reefs. The wind blew them strongly toward the east, and at every lurch they might strike. In fact, the sound of the reef soon redoubled on the starboard side of the bow. They must luff again. John put the helm down again and brought her up. The breakers increased under the bow of the vessel, and it was necessary to put her about to regain the open sea. Whether she would be able to go about under shortened sail, and badly trimmed as she was, remained to be seen, but there was nothing else to be done. "Helm hard down," cried Mangles to Wilson. The Macquarie began to near the new line of reefs. In another moment the waves were seen dashing on submerged rocks. It was a moment of inexpressible anxiety. The spray was luminous, just as if lit up by sudden phosphorescence. The roaring of the sea was like the voice of those ancient tritons whom poetic mythology endowed with life. Wilson and Mulready hung to the wheel with all their weight. Some cordage gave way, which endangered the foremast. It seemed doubtful whether she would go about without further damage. Suddenly the wind fell and the vessel fell back, and turning her became hopeless. A high wave caught her below, carried her up on the reefs, where she struck with great violence. The foremast came down with all the fore-rigging. The brig rose twice and then lay motionless, heeled over on her port side at an angle of 30 degrees. The glass of the skylight had been smashed to powder. The passengers rushed out. But the waves were sweeping the deck from one side to the other, and they dared not stay there. John Mangles, knowing the ship to be safely lodged in the sand, begged them to return to their own quarters. "Tell me the truth, John," said Glenarvan calmly. "The truth, my lord, is that we are at a standstill. Whether the sea will devour us is another question, but we have time to consider." "It is midnight." "Yes, my lord, and we must wait for the day." "Can we not lower the boat?" "In such a sea, and in the dark, it is impossible. And besides, where could we land?" "Well then, John, let us wait for the daylight." Will Halley, however, ran up and down the deck like a maniac. His crew had recovered their senses, and now broached a cask of brandy and began to drink. John foresaw that if they became drunk, terrible scenes would ensue. The captain could not be relied on to restrain them. The wretched man tore his hair and wrung his hands. His whole thought was his uninsured cargo. "I am ruined, I am lost," he would cry as he ran from side to side. John Mangles did not waste time on him. He armed his two companions, and they all held themselves in readiness to resist the sailors who were filling themselves with brandy, seasoned with fearful blasphemies.